Hello, and welcome to week 3 of my AAA 3D character modeling workshop. During the course of this week, I'm going to be talking mainly about hands. What goes into making hands, considerations you should make when modeling hands, things that you should keep in mind for deformation, ways that you can avoid making your rigging team scream and cry in anguish, and just generally ways that you can make hands quickly, easily, cleanly, and in ways that will make it easy for you to texture, easy for riggers to rig, and easy for you to maybe even fit to multiple different models. Say you want a skinny hand and a fat hand, or a chunky hand, that has lots of big knobbly knuckles, or one that's more slender and refined. These are different considerations that you want to make when making hands, but they're sort of interchangeable as far as topology goes. So this week we're going to be doing a few things slightly differently. Namely, I have a webcam set up, and I'm going to be doing a bit of actual live demonstration on the webcam for tonight's stream. Probably not for Thursday's stream, but I'm going to be demonstrating the best ways to model for deformation on an actual hand. And then I'm going to jump into doing retopo on the hand for this crazy werewolf guy that I've been slowly chiseling away at. So that's tonight. On Thursday, I'm going to be jumping into a little bit of UVs and how you can do UVs for hands, different methods for it. Hand UVs themselves are a bit of a bigger topic than you might give them credit for. So that's part of the reason that I'm going to be talking about hand UVs and devoting a chunk of time specifically in this week to talking about it. Then, next week, I'm going to be talking about more UVs, but this time UVs for the entire body. I'm also going to be talking about two other pretty big topics for AAA character art, and those are clothing, which I'm just going to touch on. I'm not going to get too deep into it because it's sort of its own topic, but I will mention some things that are good to keep in mind. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about transferring from tools like Marvelous Designer to ZBrush, and potentially back again. Then I'm also going to be talking about hard surface modeling specifically for character art and some of the things that entails. It's not going to be an in-depth workshop specifically on hard surface. It's going to be more about things that you should keep in mind when you are making characters that have hard surfaces, including, say, considerations for joints, considerations for deforming, where you should put soft surfaces next to hard surfaces. And I'll also be sharing some tips and pointers on doing hard surface modeling so that you can transfer between your 3D app and, say, ZBrush, or just output straight from your 3D app to a game engine. And that is where we're going to be ending the workshop next week. Through the course of that, through the course of tonight, Thursday, and next week, I will be taking more questions in the chat here on Twitch, and I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the next workshop that I'm going to be doing, which is probably going to be more texturing and materials focused. A lot of people have come to me saying that that's something that they would like to see, and I'm only too happy to oblige. That's really my favorite topic when it comes to the entire process of character art. So that's what I'm going to probably be diving into over the course of the next month. So I'll have information about signups for the private hangouts and stuff like that pretty soon. And I'm also going to have some more information about stuff like stuff like one-on-one critiques and portfolio reviews, that type of thing. So keep an ear out. Take a look at my Twitter to see if I've posted anything about it, and I'll let you know how things are going. So with that, I'm going to switch over to the webcam so that we can start talking a little bit about hands, how hands deform, and how you should start thinking of laying out geometry for hands. So here we go. Here's my desktop, and here are my hands. Now, hands are a big topic for a few reasons. One, hands are very expressive. They move around a lot. They do lots of stuff. So because of that, they need to be able to deform in a lot of different ways, and in ways that allow them to be expressive while also being easy to work with, easy to UV. So there are a lot of constraints there. So let's talk about just the basic layout of hands. Humanoid hands, not some sort of crazy alien hands. And let's start actually laying out the basics of hands geometry on one of my hands. And with that, I'm just going to use, a Sharpie. I'm going to literally be drawing on my left hand over here and demonstrating with my right. And we're going to be talking about the different ways that hands deform, the ways that they move most often, the situations where the camera in the game will be most focused on them, and certain things that you can do to make your hands read better from close up, from a distance, and any number of other topics. So let's start. Let's talk about hands. Let's talk about specifically fingers for now. Fingers are they can introduce problems. How though? How do fingers introduce problems into the things that you make? Well, for one, each person's fingers are shaped very slightly differently. Now you notice that I have fairly slender fingers. I don't have big chunky hands. You'll notice that a lot of characters you see in games have exaggerated features that you don't necessarily see on my hands. Now, they are features that you will see on some people's hands, but my hands don't really have, for example, big knobbly knuckles. I have fairly thin fingers with, when I bend the fingers, fairly pointed knuckles. But there are some things you'll want to at least have the ability to exaggerate on hands, specifically those knuckles. Now, knuckles, if you want them to read well in a game, have to deform in a certain way. They have to be able to bend at least a 90-degree angle, and in a lot of cases, even more. Because they have to bend so much, because they move around so much, because they're so expressive and they can do so many things so quickly, it's important that their main shapes be readable, and as such, you often want to exaggerate the shapes of the knuckles here, 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 here. Less so with the knuckles that attach to the rest of the hand, but still, you do want to have the basic shapes that you see. Here, let me just do this real quick so we can see the silhouette a little better. So, as you can see, when I ball up a fist, you have the four knuckles very visible. And this is something that you want to be able to see in a lot of different situations. Now, if I flatten out my hand, you'll see that from various angles, the knuckles that attach to the rest of the hand are not very visible. They only represent small bumps. However, as I bend into a fist, they become more and more exaggerated. You can start to see strong shapes coming out of there, especially on the middle knuckle. So if I pull up here and I make a fist, you can see that the back of the knuckle slightly bulges right along here. So that is a shape that you will want to be able to retain in hands that you're modeling. Now, of course, what that means is to retain that shape, you need lots of geometry in that area. So with that in mind, let's start laying out some of the geometry on this hand with that Sharpie. And let's start doing that by sort of talking about the main areas where you're going to get a lot of deformation. So first and foremost, as I've been saying, are the knuckles. So for the knuckles, you want deformation Oops, that's a bit of a thick line, but that's okay. In this area, and the corresponding ones for the other fingers. Now this is pretty rough. It doesn't need to be exact. I'm just demonstrating on my hand because we're actually going to be modeling this in a second. But I just want to call these areas out because these are areas where you're going to want to focus detail, focus your geometry, and focus time so that you get the layout of these nice and smooth and clean. Now, other areas that deform. The entire thumb. The entire thumb has a huge range of motion. It, this knuckle right here bends. This one right here bends. But then this whole area up here, this big meaty chunk right up at the top, all of this deforms to an incredible degree. So in addition to having lots of deformable geometry here, 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 you're going to want to have lots of deformable geometry in this area. You're going to want to have nice deformable geometry there for that knuckle and for this knuckle. There we go. Now let's just outline these. So here I'm just adding lines to show where the other areas of high deformation are on the hand, just to quickly rough this out. All right. So these areas, just like the knuckles up here that attach to the rest of the hand, deform quite a lot because these are the knuckles that bend at 90 degrees or more, sometimes an extreme amount in both directions if you're working with stylized animation or models, lots of squash and stretch, excuse me. So here I have the different highly deforming areas of the hand outlined. Now these are the areas that you need to be most concerned about because these are on the outside of the hand. Now in general, for most gameplay purposes, you're not going to be seeing the palm of the hand. However, there are still some areas on the palm of the hand that you're going to want to have enough supporting geometry just so that you can actually get the right shapes. In most cases, you're not going to see the palm of the hand deforming, doing this squishy stuff, because in most gameplay situations, you're going to be seeing the hand from the outside. It might be holding a gun or a hammer, or it might just be pointing. It might be, making gestures and doing stuff like this. But in general, you're mostly only going to see the back of the hand, which is part of why backs of hands in games often have some sort of interesting details around here, whereas the palm is often fairly bare. Now, in even a first-person shooter where you have, two hands holding a gun or something, usually the hand that is holding the rifle, and this is probably the wrong hand for, what you would be seeing. In the video it's a little bit off, but still, most of what you're going to be seeing is the back of the hand. And that goes for any other hand that's holding onto the front of the gun. You're mostly going to be seeing parts of the thumb up here. So really, the interior of the hand is usually not as important, but there are still areas in the palm of the hand that deform. So, for example, if you want to have a character that's able to grasp something like this, say a ball or a cup, a magazine for a rifle or a pistol or something, they are going to need some sort of supporting geometry in the palm, along with supporting geometry so that the fingers can bend inwards and not just crumple in on themselves. As you can see from this angle, when the fingers bend inwards, they're not just, they're not simply rotating on an axis like this. They're actually sort of squishing. You can see from both sides. you have this area up here, which squishes in, and you have this area in here, which squishes in. It retains mass. It retains the form to some degree, so in that case, you need geometry to support this shape in here. So with that in mind, we're going to do some more work down here. We're going to outline the joints again. There we go. So here are some lines for joints. We're also going to put some joints on the thumb. But then we're actually going to just add some basic cuts so that we can have geometry coming across here, across this pad, along this line, so that the mass right there is retained when the hand squishes together. So we can just add a cut right across here and connect these like so, and then have a little bit more geometry coming across like this. Now, if you're familiar with the structure of hands, if you look at your hand, usually people have two creases. A crease going right along here, and then one right there, and then you have the one that goes along the base of the thumb right here. This isn't something you usually need to worry about so much when modeling hands, because, as I mentioned before, usually the palm of the hand is going to be hidden, so all you're really going to see is this. It's all going to be kind of hidden in shadow and darkness. So really all you need are cuts going crosswise in the geometry. Now you need some way to connect these cuts to the top of the hand. So with that in mind, you'll want to extend loops down through here, extend cuts, so that you can actually have geometry down there between the fingers, and then continue them so that they just come down like this. Now we can add some more cuts to support the shapes of the thumb pad in here. So in that case, we'd probably want to outline that big main shape and then have loops coming down from inside the thumb. And these can just cut across as well. Now, the good thing about having geometry that cuts straight across the hand, like so, is that you can easily connect it to the top of the hand. And the top back of the hand is not an area that's going to deform much, so you don't need too much detail in there, modeling-wise. For sculpting, it might be nice to get some of those tendons and other cool details, but really, for our purposes right now, if we're just talking about low poly models, really all we have to do is just continue this line, and that line, and then come across like that. Now these will go across the back of the hand, and since we have this line coming across the thumb, it can actually go across the middle of the front. So the cross section of the thumb will probably end up being something along these lines with 8 sides, and then the tip will have some stuff going across it. So there's the tip of your thumb. So what we can do is we can continue that line up and around, and this actually gives us some very useful stuff to work with, because we are adding geometry in here, and that geometry can stretch across this line. So that line, which crumples in on itself, stretches, does all sorts of fun stuff, is getting supported by geometry coming around from the bottom of the hand, or alternately going this way. Either one would work, but it's going along the thumb, and it's actually continuing along here. Now this is handy, because what this does is it allows us to structure the fingers the same way we structure the thumb. We can have this sort of cross shape on the tip, which is good for sculpting, and it allows us to put a seam going all the way around Let me just make sure that's on camera. There we go. All the way around. It's a little wiggly, but that's okay. And we can continue this along here, along here, along here, and then eventually along the back of the hand. Boop, boop, a doo. So, like so. Now, it looks a little rough, but that's just a demonstration of the general areas where you want to concentrate detail and a sort of demonstration of how you can continue geometry from the palm onto the back of the hand and make it easy to work with that geometry. So that's great. That's fine. How do we actually apply this to our 3D modeling, though? Well, you notice that I outlined these knuckles with squares, and I made sure to note that the cross-section of the thumb is going to be 8-sided. That's very handy because if you want to connect a square to something that's 8-sided, you can easily have something like this, which is a square. You just cut the square down the middle, and if you want to add another division to the square, you just go like that. So that's how we're going to do things. We're going to start with squares. We're going to use the same methodology that we used when we were starting up this guy. And from there, we're going to use subdivision, we're going to draw out more geometry, and we're going to gradually build up so that we can attach that hand to the wrist. And from there, we'll talk a little bit about UVs, a little bit more about deformation, a little bit about the areas on the palm which you want to have more or less geometry, the areas on the back of the hand where you want to have more or less geometry, but we're going to do it on an actual model as opposed to just on my hand, which now looks really goofy. So let's do that. Let's get started by retopologizing this guy's hand in a very simple fashion, and then between today and Thursday, we'll continue that work. We'll continue building his hand, and we'll start adding more detail and connecting it to the rest of the body. So the first thing I want to do is hide all the unnecessary stuff, because having a bunch of geometry behind the hands when I'm trying to rotate around it and stuff is kind of annoying. So we'll just hide this, and we're going to hide anything that isn't his hand. There we go. Alrighty. So let's start with the knuckles, just like we did before. Just going to do this. There we go. Do the same thing over here. All right. Move this into position. And actually, now that we have these two quads right here, we can bridge them. And what that's going to do is give us a loop that we can extend down between the fingers. We'll ignore that for now. We'll just start by getting the knuckles into place. And once we have the knuckles into place, we can start building the rest of the hand, which should go fairly quickly once we have these basic shapes in place. So do this. There we go. Okay, so here are the knuckles, and here is the geometry that's going to go between the fingers down here. Let's move this a little bit. Make sure that this is going to be aligned. This is aligned. Oh, one moment. Let me just make sure that my tablet is working. I believe I'm having some driver issues. There we go, that's better. Sorry about the little delay there. Okay, so now that we have those knuckles in place, let's start building out some of the other geometry we talked about, some of the other loops. So I know that we need some geometry in this area, but let's just start with the basic structure of the thumb. And then we're going to build that same general basic structure on all the other fingers. Now I could copy and paste these, but really it's going to be almost as fast to just build them out individually because we're starting very slow and with very simple geometry. So let's get that knuckle and the rest of the finger in there. Oop. Alright, so there's the knuckle, just like we have on the other guys. Let's move this up to here. Okay, so you notice that this guy has kind of weird flat tips to his fingers. This is because eventually I'm going to have claws poking out of here. But the claws are going to be separate pieces, so I'm not really going to worry about it too much. So really I'm just going to come down across that. And this is going to be the basis for my thumb. It's going to be the basis for that 8-sided cross-section that I talked about. And I'm going to be using the same process for these fingers that I used for the rest of the body by using 4, 8, 16, etc. sided cylinders for all of his limbs. I'm going to be able to really easily subdivide it and connect bits together. Alright, have that come down in there. This come down here. And then, oops, we will connect this. Just going to connect that knuckle. And then the interior of the knuckle. And the outside. Okay, so now I have this sort of boxy shape, sort of like I had with the arms and legs and the tail. So now, let's do the same thing that I did with those and then just subdivide it. Now there's going to be some areas it doesn't quite catch perfectly, but most of it just pops into the right position. So let's get the tip of the finger looking right, the tip of the thumb rather. Even this out. There we go. Alright, so as you can see already, what I'm getting is the general shapes of the thumb, including a bit of concentrated detail along the joint. However, I don't have as much detail on that joint as I would like, and what that means is that I just need to add a little bit more. Now, the main reason that I want to add more is the same reason that I wanted to add more to the elbow when I was working on the elbow, or the knee when I was working on the knee. And that's because when this bends, this single point right here, this little peak, is not going to deform or have enough resolution to show the sort of silhouette that we're looking for. So I'm going to do two things for this joint. One, I'm actually going to add some more detail by just adding more loops like this. But I'm also actually going to add some detail by beveling it in like this. And what that's going to do is allow me to exaggerate the shape of the knuckle, like I talked about before, so that it's more readable from various angles, and it's going to give a little bit more geometric detail that a rigger could use to make this deform a little bit better. So we can pull this in towards the center, like so. And you notice that it now has a much smoother silhouette. So we're going to do the same over here. We're going to try and even this out a little bit. sort of straighten some of these lines. All right. So, you know, it's not perfect. It's a very rough start, but we can exaggerate the shape of the knuckle like you see here. It starts to look kind of knobbly on top, which is good. That means it's going to read well from a distance. And because of the extra geometry that beveling like this gave us, what that means is that it's going to deform a lot more smoothly. So let's talk about that center loop that I mentioned before that goes and connects the thumb along here to the other fingers along this line. So it's good to have a loop going along the center of the fingers because what that does is allows us to, one, select a big long group of polygons along the entire hand so that we can easily select things. However, it also allows us to add a UV seam that allows us to get the front and back of the hand as either separate islands or as one contiguous island that is easy to work with by having a single seam. So let's start building the rest of the fingers and then connect them to the thumb right over here. So we're going to start by building the sides of this finger. Have it come down to the knuckle, right along here, and then to the fingertip. Here's this. Alrighty. Using that same method that I used for the thumb. I'm going to hide the thumb right now because it's annoying me. Just going to come down like this. And down here. And just start connecting geometry. Alright, so there is one finger down. And what I get now is a structure that's very, very similar to the one that I have on the thumb. So, as you can see, when I subdivide this, it has 8 sides. You can see there's 8 edges here. I'm still getting, I am getting the same problems that I got with the thumb. Specifically, there isn't enough detail along these knuckles to deform really well. So I'm going to be adjusting that by adding more loops, and I'm also going to be building out the rest of the fingers. So let's quickly build out the rest of the fingers. 2 and 3. Now, one good thing about building out the fingers in very low poly fashion like this is that once I have them all blocked in, it'll be very easy for me to make large-scale changes if I need to before I have finalized geometry. that is why I want to get all of them in place, even with just rough shapes, so that then I can go back, tweak things, make large-scale adjustments very quickly. Make sure that these fingers are nicely aligned along the middle over here, and over here. Now I can bridge these. So that I have geometry for the finger pads. Oops. Here we go. Once again, making sure things are aligned nicely. Now we can just close off the fingertips. And this is where things start to get fun and interesting. Now that I have the basic shapes laid out, I can actually add more cuts for additional detail on the knuckles. I can subdivide things so that you have more of a center line going. But already you actually see if I select this loop, it's connecting to this area, right? Oh, I haven't bridged these. Let's bridge those real fast and then go back to there. There we go. Now, if I select this loop, it selects all of those polygons along there. That means that if I have a UV seam going along here, I'm going to be able to split the thing into front and back very easily when I go to UV this. It's going to be extremely fast, and it's also going to be a lot easier to work with than having, say, some sort of weird spiral or something. Now, in addition to making sure that all these fingers have the same sides, I'm also going to be thinking about, you know, the layout of the polygons and such farther down the road, but also how they're going to be textured, which is why I want to think about the UVs at this early stage. If I think about the UVs at this early stage, I'm going to constantly have them in mind, and I'm going to be constantly thinking about how I can optimize the model so that the UVs will be easier to work with. So let's add some detail to all these knuckles. Let's just add another couple of loops. Let's see what that does for us. Nope, not quite right yet, but that's okay. We can just round it out a little. There we go. Oh, that's starting to look a lot better. And it's starting to match the level of detail in the thumb. You'll notice that these joints now have just as many polygons as these ones, as this one does over here. Okay, that's a great start. Now, in addition to having the same number of loops for the knuckles, starting with just boxy shapes for the thumb and for all the fingers lets me do this nice connection right over here. I can take and connect right along here and here, and that gives one continuous edge loop going all the way around the fingers. It's easy to work with, it's easy to rig, and it's easy to UV map that. Also, since I have this geometry in here going at right angles to what's below it, it's going to be able to easily deform back and forth in this direction. So let's add just a little bit of detail right in the middle in there, just to support things. And you'll notice that since I have this right here, this polygon, I can actually extend this out and connect it and start making a continuous loop from right over here all the way to, say, this knuckle. I can bridge that very easily. And I can connect it in an identical fashion underneath. I just need to have geometry under there that follows this same structure. So let's do that. We'll extrude this. This. Have these connect. Then, oops, I can just connect these two. Yeah, it's a little bit rough right now, but that's okay. We can tweak and adjust. Alrighty, so very quickly, by having lots of continuous loops, we found that we can easily have geometry that follows the curvature of the hands, will deform well because there's enough information, or enough resolution rather, in the important areas like these knuckles, and we're making geometry that's very easy to work with because it's all just connected in continuous edge loops like this one. So let's bridge this and this. Now, oops, didn't really want to go in there, did it? So we can just extend this up like that. Start filling out the interior of the hand. Now you may find when you're modeling hands, you run into situations like I'm running into right now where you have lots of excess geometry in certain areas, and in this case it's easy to just terminate some of these things in, say, a triangle. Now if it's on the palm, like I mentioned earlier, it's easy to work with palms because you don't see them very often. So it's just fine to terminate things in ways that are, say, roughly triangular or have four sides but aren't a rectangle. So for example, this right here. And when that subdivides, it's still going to subdivide cleanly. And you're still going to get fairly clean loops with it. So let's go back. Let's connect these. Let's just kind of even things out a little bit. Let's close these up. So now we have a continuous loop there, as well as a continuous loop here. And all of these are easy to select as well. So what else do you want to keep in mind when you're modeling hands, aside from having the right amount of geometry on things like knuckles? Well, there are a few things to keep in mind. One, how is it going to connect to the wrist? How many polygons does the wrist have, and are you going to have the right number to attach to the wrist? Two, are you aligning the fingers properly according to the rig? If you're working on, say, just a one-off model that uses its own rig, that's not usually as much of a problem. However, if you were working on, say, a bunch of civilians or something for a big open world game, you can't model every single individual one of the hundreds or dozens, hundreds, thousands of civilian models that you're going to see in the game. So instead you need to share assets between them. And in that case, you're going to want to model all these hands that you make to the same rig. Or, alternately, you're going to want to model the hands in similar poses and shapes so that you can use the same rig for all of them. And in that case, what you'll want to do is make sure that every single one of the joints is in the right place relative to the rig, and all these loops that go down the center of the fingers are also perfectly aligned with that rig. So in that case, you'd be working with whoever is doing the rigs to make sure that they supply you with either a copy of the rig or a set of locators or something along those lines, so that when you try and align those things, you can do it very quickly and easily in your modeling app of choice. So I'm just going to go through here. I'm going to start aligning things a little bit better, and then from there we're going to talk about building some of the rest of the hand. We're going to start connecting parts of this hand to other parts of it, making sure that all these loops look nice, and we're going to make sure that we can easily sculpt on this hand, easily animate this hand, easily texture this hand. So let me just start on that, and then we can dive back into a little more of the theory. Alrighty, so I've gotten a lot of this stuff nice and smoothed out. There's still a couple of small areas, like, say, this fingertip, that don't quite line up as perfectly as I'd like, but that's something I'll keep on tweaking and adjusting. But for now, there are some other things that we need to take into consideration. First and foremost, once again, the knuckles. So we're going to do the same thing with the other knuckles that we did over here on the thumb. We're going to bevel this in here so that it adds a bit more usable detail and allows us to get some of that silhouette back, no matter what subdivision level we're at. So I'm going to do that fairly quickly, but I'm also actually going to do the same thing to the knuckles up here. The main reason that I'm going to do it to the knuckles up here, and I'm going to include this loop, is because as we saw before when I was demonstrating deformation on an actual hand, there needs to be a large amount of bending up this high. And I'm actually going to be adding a little bit more detail along this entire loop. I'm probably just going to push it down a bit and just make that whole area a little bit tighter. That'll allow me to have better deformation in that area. Additionally, I'm going to be moving it down so that it can align with the main crease that you get in the interior of the hand, so that in the off chance that we do see the palm of the hand while it's deforming, it will be deforming pretty nicely. Now, we don't need to bevel the inside down here because it's not seen as much, so we don't get to see either the details of it moving around or any sort of silhouette breakup down there. So it's not something we need to worry about on the palm. Let's just move all this stuff down a little bit so we have more even distribution of polygons. There we go. This is going to move down as well, and I'll just be adding some more loops in here. And let's add another loop going up like this, just so that we have some stuff to play with. There we go. Now these polygons are going to be supporting the shapes of the tendons underneath the skin, so it'll be helpful to have that kind of detail up there, following those contours. Alright, so we've got that. We've got this extending along the palm, and there are a couple ways that I can connect this loop to the thumb. One is to have an additional loop go through here, which I'm going to be adding anyway because there's not enough detail in there for it to deform well. Another is to do something along these lines. Now, either of these could work. However, the advantage of having another loop through here is that I can have a continuous loop going all the way around the thumb. So let's do that. There we go. And here we go. Now I can connect these right here. This right here. So there is another continuous loop. There's a continuous loop going around the thumb. It's all very tidy. Additionally, there is this area right in here which doesn't have a ton of detail. There are a couple of things that I can do about that, but I'm going to worry about it after I get the knuckles done. So let's bevel those knuckles and go from there. So we've got some good shapes and some not so good ones. We'll just kind of smooth some stuff out. You'll notice that we have this big pole right here in this area. I'm probably going to want to extend this loop up farther up into this area so that it doesn't interfere with these. But I'll do that in a minute once I get all of these other knuckles smoothed out. Let's just do this. Here we go. Just even out some of this geometry in here. With this being very even, it'll allow us to sculpt nice detail in there, and it'll also allow a rigger to get some nice weight painting in there. There we go. Alright, so we've got some basic stuff going for these knuckles. There are a few more adjustments that I'd probably want to make. I might even want to actually extend it down so that they have a little more geometry, down in this area as well. But we're not going to worry about that too much for now. We have the basic concepts out of the way. So let's just cut some more geometry up in these areas so that we don't have, 7 edges going all into the same spot. So we'll just cut. Let's just turn off the background constraint real quick so that things are slightly faster in here. There we go. All right. Now let's get back to this. here, cut like this, like this. Making a mess here. That's okay. This over here. And cut right here. There we go. Nice and rounded out. Okay. One more. Cut along here. Have another loop through here. Even this area out a little bit. As well as this area. Like that. And when we subdivide this, it's going to have, oops, well, we have an extra vertex in there. Where are you? There you are. When we subdivide this, it's going to have nice clean geometry. It's going to deform pretty well, all the way up to here, as well as down in this area. So let's just go back. Now you notice that I have some big 5-sided polygons up here, some big ingons, but when I subdivide, they just get turned into a bunch of quads. So I don't really need to worry about that being messy, because I'm going to be subdividing this anyway so that it can connect with the rest of the arm and the rest of the body. So now we need to fill out the rest of the hand, and this can be either easy or challenging depending upon how you want to do it. I find that it's easiest to work with if you have the same number of sides in the wrist as you do for the rest of the arm. And that's also one area where you'll want to have lots of deformable geometry in this area. So I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to add a few more cuts up in this area. I'm going to add some more geo so that this area can deform well. And I'm also going to do some things like terminate loops and stuff in here. So let's get that started. So over the next hour, well, roughly 50 minutes, I'm going to be working on the rest of this hand. I'm going to be adding more cuts, taking some cuts away, evening out some of the areas of geometry that are uneven, like in here, where you can see that there's alternating, where it alternates between nicely packed and kind of loose polygon density. So if you have any questions right now through the chat on Twitch, you can feel free to ask them, and I'll see if I can answer as I'm working on this. So feel free to fire away, and it can be about more than just modeling hands as well. There's a lot that goes into making characters for games, and I'm more than happy to answer questions about the different aspects of making characters. So yeah, feel free. Meanwhile, I'm mostly just going to be trying to connect some of these areas without having either too dense or too loose of geometry. One of the questions I'm getting in chat right now is what all the programs are that I use at work. For those of you who don't know, I work at Insomniac Games. I'm currently working on Spider-Man for the PS4, and that's due out sometime next year. That next year being 2018. For those of you watching this in the far-flung future. The programs I use most at work are... well, we have some listed here, ZBrush and Modo. I definitely use ZBrush, Modo. For a lot of my texture painting, I use Substance Painter. For various modeling tasks or model-related tasks that are not modeling like this, I do use Maya, though that's mainly because the tools that we use to connect to our in-house engine run through Maya. They run through Maya and Perforce. So that, you know, there are certain things that it's just easier to do in Maya because it's connected to our engine tools. Additionally, I use Photoshop for all kinds of things, not just for, you know, making textures or whatever, but also for, you know, small amounts of either texture cleanup or maybe making just small adjustments to textures. We also do lots of feedback and you know, reviews and such at work, so it's important to be able to give visual feedback to other artists. So doing that in the form of paintovers is pretty helpful. So I'll often use Photoshop for that as well. We do use a smattering of other programs at work. Lots of people use lots of different stuff. For example, we have a Houdini artist who's in charge of a lot of procedurally generated content, which is then touched by mostly environment artists. That has to do with things like, you know, placing trim meshes and buildings and that type of thing at the right coordinates in world space. But there are other things that we use it for as well, like deformation of models that are supposed to generally be world props, but then need to somehow deform. For example, if you go and watch trailers for Spider-Man, you'll see that he can, you know, he can grab onto certain things with his webs and swing them around and use them as improvised weapons. And, you know, we might have like a garbage can or a junction box, and it probably wouldn't be worth it to model those all out by hand, so some of it gets done in Houdini. And there are lots of other proprietary programs that we use as well. In addition, we also use lots of plugins that have been written in-house for importing stuff into our engine, for working between our engine and Perforce, so that we have, we can easily keep track of all the files that go into the engine, that type of thing. So it's not just using, say, Maya for modeling. There's also, a lot of using it for things that are asset check-in related and stuff like that. I believe you'll find that that's the case in most studios. Most studios have some large mix of programs that they use for various tasks that maybe they weren't originally meant to do that, but they work very well for it. Additionally, we do use things like Marmoset Toolbag for baking because it's very, very fast and easy to use. It's also useful for testing out, quick shaders and that type of thing, because if you have a program like Toolbag that lets you bash out something very quickly in a prototype stage, it's easier to get that into the engine and get it working properly because you have a baseline to work against. So we definitely use Toolbag for a lot of our baking, as well as for a lot of, say, previs and stuff along those lines. And that's not just for characters. We also use Toolbag along with a few other tools like xnormal or nulled, depending upon the type of object or character that we're working on. And each program has its own strengths and weaknesses. For example, Substance Painter is great at painting out materials and stuff, but its baking system is a little bit slower and more cumbersome than something like Toolbag, so that's why we use Toolbag instead. Substance Painter is an excellent tool, but it doesn't have visual feedback in the same way that Toolbag does for baking, so that's one of the main reasons that we use it a lot. Something else that's nice about Toolbag is that when you go to bake ambient occlusion textures, you can turn on a simulated floor, which makes it so that the bottom sides of your models get more ambient occlusion than the top. And if you're doing, say, characters that need to just be sort of standing around or maybe walking about but don't need to, run and jump between buildings or something, it's a lot nicer to have that type of top-down ambient occlusion because it makes the models look a little more grounded than they otherwise would. So there are some things in the palm of the hand that I can do to achieve various effects. One thing I definitely want to do, and one thing I definitely want to keep in mind, is that this thing has to connect to the rest of the arm, and right now the rest of the arm has 16 sides. Now that's not something that's 100% necessary, but it is something that makes it easier to work with. So I want the hand, or rather the connection between the hand and the wrist, to have 16 sides as well. So one thing that I like to do is, as I'm keeping that in mind, I start going in and bridging things and looking at edges like this, where it shows me that even though they're not 100% connected right now, I do have 16 edges, and that's information that I can work with. And as I mentioned before, with the palm of the hand, it's okay if it doesn't have 100% perfect geometry or 100% perfect volume, as long as it has enough to fill it in. So one of the things I'm going to do is put slightly suboptimal topology in the palm to make it so that I can easily connect the palm, or rather the entire rest of the hand, to the wrist. So one thing I could do is, say, put some ingons right here. But there are other things that I can do to make it work a little bit better, because this area right here still does deform a lot, so I want some nice even geometry in there. So I'm not going to have this one be ingons, but I might have an ingon somewhere over in this area. And let's do, might even make it so that right over here we have a big ingon. Put it across there so we can connect these together. Got a quad right here. And maybe one thing we could do is connect like this. Have, say, a triangle right here, or a quad that goes like this. There's lots of different ways that you can connect geometry in this area. It doesn't have to all be completely perfect, because most of the time people aren't going to see it. And wow, that was fun. Got some interesting errors there. Ooh, what are we doing here? I think we got some vertex order issues, but that's fine. We can solve that a little bit later. Okay, so that's looking pretty solid, and we've got 16 edges along the wrist. Now, one of the things that I can do is I can delete some of these, unhide the rest of the body, and then bridge that. It's looking pretty okay. Now I can even some stuff out. Pull that up there. Even out the placement on the pad of the thumb. That's this up a little bit. Make this just generally feel a lot smoother. I can move this loop down a bit so we have more spacing on the back of the hand. That ought to do it. Now, let's add some more loops in here. That's pretty good. It's nice and even. I'll add, say, ooh, that's not looking very good down there though. So let's add one loop. Make sure that that one loop is nice and even, and then start adding loops from there. Oh, you know why it's uneven? Because this loop around here is uneven. So we can just move it down like this. Make sure that's even, and go from there. Nice. Let's add one more loop in here just so we have some nice deformation in this area, which is going to be moving around a lot when this guy moves his hands. Let's actually do it this way. There we go. Nice. All right. So we still have a little bit of a mess in this area of the palm of the hand. It's going to be a little bit difficult to work with since this is a weird sort of spirally loop. So now I'm just going to start trying to clean that up. So there's another question that I'm getting in the chat, which is about how long do you spend on retopoing a AAA character from start to finish? It's a good question, and unfortunately the answer is it depends, which is not a very good answer. However, there are some general guidelines that you can use. For example, in general, it should take more or less a month to create a character from start to finish. That's sort of been the guideline that I've gotten in a lot of cases. It's been the general rule, and I found it holds up most of the time. The only times when it doesn't hold up are when you have lots of rounds of feedback and that type of thing. So that's something you'll want to consider when taking the answer that I gave. Now, for example, a character in Spider-Man that's not a main character, not like some sort of, it's not Peter Parker, for example. They're going to take significantly less time than a main character, because main characters often go through long rounds of feedback and iteration until you land on a final look for the character. However, sometimes even with side characters, you do run into problems where things take a little bit longer. However, again, in general, for something that's not going to be having a ton of screen time, a month is usually a good sort of estimate for how long that character should take, because often what happens is you'll get a concept or some sort of direction for a character, and then you'll take roughly a week to make a high poly model, then another roughly a week to make a low poly with with the start of UVs and such, and then another week for textures, and a final week. The amount of that final week of the 4 weeks is generally taken up by just general feedback for a character that's not a main character. So in that case, probably what you're looking at is a week for retopo and UVs, meaning that depending upon the type of character that you're making, retopo should take between 3 and 4 days. Maybe more, maybe less, depending upon how complex the character is. If I was working on a movie like Iron Man or something, and I had to model Iron Man's suit, that would take significantly longer than me just putzing around with this guy on streams for a couple hours, a couple of times a week. Iron Man's suit, or I don't know, something from a Transformers movie. Those are things that are going to take significantly longer than a standard humanoid organic character, simply because they have so many more parts that have to be modeled out, looked at, critiqued, edited, given feedback on, that type of thing. So those are the types of things that will affect the time that it takes to create a character. The feedback, the just general complexity. Sometimes a more complex character will take a lot longer than a week to model the high poly, simply because there are not enough hours in the day to get all of that detail in there. So you just need to put your head down and work on it forever and ever and ever. And that was kind of a long-winded way of saying about a month. About a month for the whole process, and 3 or 4 days to do retopo in a lot of cases. I hope that sort of answers the question in a satisfactory way. And I am just not happy with this area of the hand, which is why I keep going back to it. I think there's some stuff that I can do to make it work a little bit better, because I want more consistent detail in here. So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep the same number of loops around the wrist, but I'm going to try to think of some good ways to attach the hand to the wrist so that I can have more detail in the hand and the same amount of detail in the wrist that I currently have. And one way that I'm doing that right now is by adding more loops in this area. Not sure it's going to work right now, but I think it might be successful. I hope it will be successful. Let's see here. So we've got this guy coming along here, going along the contour of the pad of the thumb. What do we got? The number of sides here. 13 inches, that's a weird number. Well, we certainly have a little bit more detail here on the back of the hand, which is good. Let's see if we can continue that down, have it connect in here in a better way. Let's see what we got here. Okay. So by taking what was a large n-gon up in this area and turning it into quads, I've essentially pushed that n-gon to a separate area of the model, right down here. That's not necessarily bad, and it actually can lead to situations like this. However, I'm not sure I like the way this loop is laid out, but it might work. This is an area that I do have some flexibility with, and something that I was having a little bit of trouble with at work recently because I took it upon myself to remodel our base hand meshes because they weren't working quite how we needed them to. I think this will work a bit, but if not, I can always adjust it later. So I'm going to keep adding detail here, tweaking things, making adjustments over the next, say, 30 minutes or so. And then after that, I'm going to be hopping into the private Google Hangout with the folks who signed up through Patreon to get stuff like portfolio reviews and model and texture feedback, you know, talk about game industry stuff, look for portfolio reviews and that type of thing. So if that is something that sounds cool to you, if it's something that you would be interested in doing, especially if it is focused on making textures and materials, you might want to check out the Patreon that I have set up. I've got some sign-up stuff on there. I'm going to be closing out the current batch soon and then opening up new ones for the next workshop that I do, which, as far as I know, right now, is going to be mostly focused on making textures, including lots of baking, UVs, talking about different types of textures, including physically based rendering, or textures specifically for physically based rendering. I'm probably going to be talking a bit about rendering, though not as heavily as I did during the last one of these that I did, which was focused almost exclusively on rendering and materials, with less emphasis on texture creation. So if that sounds interesting, my Patreon is just, it's the same username that I have here, like CK3D. So yeah, you can go take a look, see if it seems interesting. If not, you don't have to sign up. You are free to do it or not do it. If it does sound interesting, you want to kick a few bucks my way, that is super cool, but I will be doing the same sort of setup that I have here during the next workshop, where I do a public stream and then hop into a private Google Hangout for an hour after the public portion's finished. So just something to keep in mind if that sounds cool. If not, no harm. Alrighty, so I've got most of the detail in his hand that I want, but I do have a weird spiral around his thumb, which is not cool. So to counteract that spiral, I'm actually going to delete some of this stuff and do some tweaking in here. Let's see what we got here. This is 10 inches. Okay. So I want to retain this loop right here and here. Let's see what I can do about the rest of this though. So I'm not a big fan of how this right here is laid out. Maybe if I edit some things over here, we can fix it. I like to have nice continuous loops around things like thumbs and fingers and wrists because it just makes it generally easier to select stuff. You know what I can do? I can sort of push where the spiral went so that I can split this right there, have it connect right here, and then have this come in right here, connect here, and then have this connect to here, and this to here. We can push this loop up a little bit. So that's still a continuous loop going along his hand. And we have a nice loop like that. And this loop sort of goes along his finger. It's not perfect, but I like it a little better than I did the last iteration. One problem though is that this loop gets pushed up really far over here. We can kind of relax this area though. Push this down, adjust this. That's better. I've got another question in chat. What's the approval process at a game studio? I'm guessing your lead has to okay it, and then it goes to the art director, and then maybe to Marvel or some client. That is essentially correct. It depends on what specifically you're working on, and it's going to be different from studio to studio. You know, just because different studios find different ways of working that work for them. Now, in a situation where you are working with either some sort of client, like in this example, Marvel or Sony, since I'm working on Spider-Man and we're working with Marvel and Sony, yes, you would end up having to get their approval for a lot of the work that you're doing. So for example, if you are making the model of Spider-Man, that's going to be the main model that everybody sees throughout the game, that's going to have a long iterative process, which is going to have lots of changes and adjustments and stuff, sometimes throughout the life cycle of the project. The process involved in that is generally what is described. You make something and then get approval from your lead, who passes it up the chain to the art director or whoever is in charge of making decisions of that nature, and then they will show, say, Marvel or Sony, the product that you're working on, and from there they will give any feedback, approval, disapproval, blah, blah, blah. Now, if you're working on something that is entirely an in-house product, or something that's maybe funded by someone else, but is still your own, your studio's IP. In that case, there's going to be a lot fewer steps, and it's probably going to be a little bit quicker to get approval for most things, simply because there are fewer hoops to jump through when you're trying to get approval for something. In that case, it could just simply be, oh, the head character artist says, yes, it looks cool, then you put it in the game, make any adjustments that are necessary to make it actually function, and then you're done. That it could be as simple as that. That's getting a little less common these days, since a lot of game studios are starting to become more like movie studios in that they will produce a game based on outside IP or money. So it really depends on where you're going and what you're doing. But in general, yes, the process will often essentially be you produce some work according to whatever guidelines, show it to your lead signs off on it, and anybody above him signs off on it and gives you changes or adjustments to make. You make those changes, adjustments, and then go through the whole process again. It's very iterative, very collaborative. It's actually a process that I tend to like, simply because it allows me to sort of distance myself from the work a little bit, meaning that I don't have to essentially kill my babies as often. I don't get super attached to something that somebody else has massive amounts of feedback on, so I don't have to, worry about whether or not I am killing the spirit of the thing that I just made. It's essentially somebody else's product, therefore I'm just making it for them. It removes, at least for me, it removes some of the stress involved in making art for entertainment, because it means that really, if it ends up sucking, it's somebody else's fault. And if it ends up great, that means you did something right. So, we are quickly approaching one of the parts of modeling and retopology that I enjoy the most, which is the stage when everything is finally starting to come together. The hands and feet are attached, the head is in pretty decent shape. There are only a couple of small areas that I need to fix. And if I press that magical subdivide button, I get something that looks pretty close to a final product. It's not 100% perfect yet. There's still some areas that need work. I need to adjust topology in a couple of spots. I probably need to repose his head, make sure that the jaw is a little more closed and stuff, but I can finally see where all this hard work is going. I'm in the home stretch, essentially, now that I have all the basic forms in place, and all that's left to do is a minor bit of sculpting and some other stuff, and then I'll be using a version of this mesh after I've done some additional tweaking and adjustments in ZBrush on the reprojected high poly, and I'll be using this as the low poly. And that's exciting. That's a lot of fun, because it means that the kind of boring work of doing retopology is more or less finished, and I can finally get on to the fun stuff like, texturing and rendering and blah, 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 blah. That's the kind of thing that I enjoy the most. I also just love pressing the subdivide button because it just smooths everything out and makes it look oh so pretty. So yeah, we're hitting the 15-minute mark, where 15 minutes from now I will be hopping off the public stream and going to the private one. So If you have any more questions, feel free to ask in the Twitch chat. I'll be looking at this as I continue tweaking small little things across portions of the model now. Over the course of the next stream, I'm going to be doing the UVs for the hands, and I'm also going to be starting to talk about UVs for the rest of the body, though I'm probably going to also be finishing off some of the topology for the head, including the inside of the mouth, the connection between, say, the ear and anywhere where it connects or is supposed to connect to the body. And I'm probably going to do some retopology for the claws and that type of thing as well. Then, finally, next week I'll be talking about clothing, a little bit of hard surface stuff, and I'll be talking about UVs for his entire body and hair cards for this guy. I'm not going to get too deep into hair cards because this guy doesn't really call for any sort of like fancy coiffed hair or anything like that. But the work that I'm going to be doing with the hair cards should at least inform you enough that you can get a good start on making hair cards for humanoid characters, and that will drastically speed up your workflow if you know how to do that. So that's one thing I'm going to be doing a small amount of next week. And then hopefully, at some point over the next few weeks, I'll have this guy finished and ready to just kind of sit in my portfolio and look cool. And hopefully after that, one of my friends from work will be able to rig it, and maybe someone else will be able to animate it. We can get some cool stuff going online. It was mostly just done in this stream. So if you have any more questions, I'm sort of open to basically anything at this point. You know, bonus points if it's related to modeling or retopology or anything like that, but it could just be general game industry stuff, could be general art stuff. I'm not super picky. And I'll be watching the Twitch chat to see if there's any of that. So a question I'm getting right now is, what is feedback from rigging like? Do they do drawovers of the kind of topology they want? That really depends. Sometimes it's as simple as sitting down and talking about the model in its current state and saying, oh, maybe just adjust some of the edge flow in this area so that it works a little better with the tools we have, and they might show an example of how it works. In other cases, yes, they might actually do some sort of drawing or painting over a screenshot of your model. It really depends on what specifically you're looking for. One of the things that I was recently doing and will be continuing to do over the next few weeks at work is working on our hands that we use for basically all our characters. Every character uses the same hand topology, even if the textures and sometimes even UVs are a little different. So I've been working with Sophie, one of our riggers at Insomniac, to make sure that the hand geometry will work well with the pre-existing rigs that we have, as well as making sure that the placement of joints and other things is correct. And that has involved a little bit of paint over, but it's more just been collaborative discussion where we look at the model, sort of rotate around it, point out areas that might cause problems, and then try to come up with solutions that we can both use so that we can get the model and rig in the right place. Another question I've got is, how long did it take you to land your first industry job as a character artist? That's a hard question for me to answer. Let's see here. So back in 2009, 2010, I had just started working on doing custom models for Team Fortress 2. And what that entailed was making stuff that eventually would find its way into the first community-driven update for Team Fortress 2. So I made some of the weapon models that went in there. That was in 2010, I believe, late 2010. And after that was when I actually began applying for character art jobs in earnest. Before that, I had sent out a few applications, but my portfolio was not in a good state for doing professional work at that point. But eventually, I scraped together enough work that I was able to present it in such a way that it was fairly appealing to a local game company. So between the period when some of the work I did for TF2 was released and May, June of 2011, that was when I landed my first job. So it was roughly 6 months, 5 or 6 months before I actually landed my first job after sending out my first applications to different places. But that was after doing lots of work on personal stuff and stuff for TF2. I had been aware of jobs in the game industry for a while before that, but had only started applying a few months prior. So it's kind of a mixed bag there. On the one hand, I did get stuff into a game, but it wasn't character work, it was weapons. But on the other, it only took me roughly 6 months to get from that point to the point where I was able to land a job. Does Insomniac have some kind of limited internet connection? I know big clients like Marvel demand more security against leaked footage or pictures of their products. That's an interesting question. As far as I know, the connection at Insomniac is not really limited in any way, mostly because people tend to be pretty well behaved about not letting stuff leak. There are other good reasons to not leak stuff, and those are you will be fired and you'll sort of be blackballed. If people find out that you have been leaking information about video games, they won't want to work with you in the future. So if they find that you've been fired or something specifically for that, they're just simply not going to talk to you, and you'll just not get jobs anymore. So that's the kind of fear of God thing that happens to make people not want to leak stuff. And so even if the internet connection is not limited, or at least as far as I know is not limited, I really couldn't say, I'm not in IT or anything, people are generally really well behaved about it because it is a fireable offense for many, many good reasons. Now, with that in mind, it is important to note that for game artists, especially character artists, it's important for us to be able to have fairly unrestricted access to the internet because we use it for reference so much. So it would be difficult for something like that to be enforced. And what it would end up doing is just making it so that people look up reference on their phones, and then they get angry at their employer that they can't look up reference and blah, 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 blah. And the whole reference situation can be difficult in some cases because in a lot of cases, a character artist might have to look at pictures of naked people on their work computer to get the kind of reference that they're looking for, the reference they need to get anatomy right or something like that. So it's often based on, keep it tasteful and work-related. Certainly you're not going to be finding people watching porn, and if they are watching porn, they're probably going to be fired immediately. But it's generally not limited in the same sense that a lot of other corporate internet systems are limited, just because nobody wants to get fired. let's see. I worked at Microsoft and got a dude I worked with at Microsoft got fired and blacklisted for posting a selfie at work with sensitive information on the whiteboard in the background. Yes, that is. Now that is exactly the type of thing where people will tend to be very careful. And if you're not careful, yeah, you'll get blacklisted. And blacklisting, even if it isn't an official thing where there is a blacklist, people absolutely talk. The game industry is a very, very small industry, despite having a large presence for events like, say, GDC. GDC, it pretty regularly gets 25 or 30,000 attendees, but a lot of those people are not, game artists or even programmers. A lot of them are, say, like marketing people or HR types, production coordinators, that type of thing. So they're not as involved in the making of stuff that a lot of other folks are. So when you have situations where somebody gets blacklisted, you're not put on an actual list. It's just people will tell all their friends and you just simply won't be hired. Let's see. Here at Sony, we had no internet on our workstations for many months because I think Disney and Marvel required we have no internet connection to work on our computers. We got separate Chromebooks to use to find reference images. But I work in VFX, so that could be the difference. I would say that, yeah, the VFX and gaming, at least currently, are different enough industries that you don't find that type of thing as much in the game industry as you do in VFX. There are a lot more established practices like that in the film industry than there are in the game industry right now. Though with large releases with, lots and lots of money behind them, like Spider-Man or maybe Call of Duty, you will start to run into situations like that. And it is getting a lot more common to have things like that. All right, and we're running into the last couple of minutes of the stream here, and that's when I'm going to be shutting off the stream and going to the private hangout. If you guys have any more questions, now would be the time to fire them off, and I'll see if I can answer them as quickly as possible. If not, you guys have a good night, and I will see you on Thursday. Like I mentioned before, Thursday I'm going to be talking about hand UVs and dipping into the UVs of the rest of the body to a certain extent. I'm probably going to focus on general organic UVs, and then for a lot of the UV talk that I do next week, I'm going to be talking about more like hard surfacey type stuff, things that have lots of hard edges or more exacting shapes than you see on here. How many more sessions will we be doing for this subject matter? So I have 3 more sessions planned after this one. One on Thursday. Oh, hello, Moto. You're being fun right now. I have one more session planned for Thursday, which is August 17th. And then the next one will be August 22nd, which is Tuesday. And then the final one... Oh my goodness, I'm getting my dates mixed up. I'm sorry. So next week is going to be mostly UVs and hard surface. Then I'm going to be taking the week after that and doing probably some just general additional content, lots of hair cards, hard surface for characters, a bit of clothing. It's going to be kind of a mixed bag for that final week. But next week is going to be mostly focused on UVs, And probably these next 2 weeks are actually going to have a lot of overlap between things, because making things like hair cards and certain hard surface details are highly dependent on UVs. So I'm probably going to be having a lot of bleed between those different sessions. Yes, so there's going to be, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more sessions. And then we're going to be talking over the next couple of weeks about what will be coming up in the next workshop. It's going to be mostly about materials and texturing. So that's pretty much it for the time I have tonight. I'm going to be shutting down the stream in just a second here. If you like this, stream, if you you want to support me or something, you can check out my Patreon. It's the same username, XCK3D. If you don't want to, that's perfectly fine. These streams are always going to be free, though if you want to see them before anybody else, essentially, or the recordings of them, rather, I do have options on the Patreon page for, getting early access to the videos as soon as they're uploaded to YouTube, along with recordings of the private Hangout sessions. So if that sounds interesting to you, check it out. If not, the option will still be there for other people, so worry not. And I will always have these online streams public for the first 2 hours and then private for the last hour of it. So anyway, that's all of tonight's session. Thank you all for watching. I know there was a lot of people coming in and out, but we had lots of really good questions, so thank you so much for that. And I will see you guys on Thursday at the same time and this same channel, 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And I'll be making sure to upload the recording of this stream to YouTube so that you can watch it again if you want to, or share it with friends who weren't able to be here. So, have a good night, and I will talk to you later.